Senator Cooper,
Excused.
Senator Jones? Here. Senator Nethercott? Here. Senator Rothfuss?
Here.
Chairman Anderson?
Here.
Excuse me. Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Welcome to all the visitors, and we're glad to see there's some interest in these bills today. We hope to get through 2 and possibly 3 bills today, Senate File 17, Senate File 18, and Senate File 19, possibly, if we have time. We're starting back up at 1:30 in the chamber, so we'll be getting out of here by 1:20 or so. So with that, remember all the rules. Everybody in here, I can see in your eyes that you know the rules, and you won't interrupt anybody, and you won't have any derogatory things to say about any of the departments that are going to testify or anything.
You're not going to shoot anybody, are you?
No. Yep. So those are some of the rules. If you violate any of our rules, I'll be sure and point it out to you. Okay, we'll start with the first bill. First bill is Senate File 17. And do we have anyone who would like to talk about Senate File 17, oil recovery stimulus? Anybody who wants to talk about it?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Senator Rothfuss.
I can start off, but then. if
Well, why
Pete
don't you
can
let-
join- Well, Pete can join us.
Why don't you
too.
let him do it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, he'll help you,
Then he
I'll
can-
tell you that.
Tell us where I'm wrong, or whatever the case may be. Mr. Chairman, we worked this over the interim, not last year, but the prior year, and spent quite a bit of time through a working group developing this legislation. It started from recommendations by University of Wyoming in their Center for Economic Analysis, and they did some work to try to determine what the implications are for 45Q credits, where 45Q actually has 3 different tiers of what the credit's going to be. The highest tier is for atmospheric carbon capture. That's not related to this bill. The next tier is for use of carbon dioxide in a permanent geological sequestration. And there's a credit associated with that, which is that $65, Pete? $65 per ton for 45Q for permanent geological sequestration. And then when it's used for enhanced oil recovery, that's diminished to $40, I believe, per ton. Is that correct? That was after the 60 and 85? Now, okay, that was after the change, I'm sorry. So yeah, it was working on the previous one. So $60 now for EOR, $85 for permanent geological sequestration. That's right, they just updated that through legislation, I think, a year ago. So that differential of $25 skews the market such that it would be in the interest of a CO2 producer to use that CO2 for permanent geological storage instead of for enhanced oil recovery. The economic analysis that was done by EORI and the Economic Center did some calculations to figure out what the true bias was there, and it came out to around $10 per ton of CO2 that was the true market bias based on the economic analysis of each use case. And so this legislation effectively provides that differential as a credit to the CO2 producer to level the marketplace on 45Q so that there isn't a market bias in place. And then it pays for that $10 off of the back end so that the oil that's produced, 3% of the severance tax goes back into a fund, which is then used for that $10 offset. So it tries to stop the market from being biased towards permanent geological sequestration and level it so that our oil and gas operators don't have to struggle to achieve or to acquire that CO2 because the market is in a fair marketplace. So I'll pause there at the high level overview. We could walk through the bill, but that's what the bill does. And I'll leave it to Pete to see what I missed.
Mr. Chairman, Pete Obermuller, Petroleum Association of Wyoming. That's a great overview. Whatever you'd like to do in terms of walking through the bill, happy to do that and go from there.
Any questions for Mr. Obermuller? Any questions? Any questions? No, none? Okay, thanks. Good presentation, Pete.
Do you want to walk through?
Do you want me to walk through the bill, Mr. Chairman? or no?
No, I don't want to. You want to walk through the bill?
You can if you want to. If
You
you
want
want to
to?
see what the bill does, Mr. Chairman.
All right, let's do it then. They want to.
Okay, Mr. Chairman,
All right.
appreciate it.
Quick, walk quick.
I will briskly walk.
Yeah, briskly walk.
No running in the halls.
Yeah, so, Mr. Chairman, as the senator from Albany County pointed out, the idea here is to equalize 45Q between permanent sequestration and enhanced oil recovery. Why do we want to do that? Because the way the federal government has imposed itself on capturing and distribution of CO2 has tipped the scales in favor of permanent sequestration. I'm not necessarily opposed to permanent sequestration, just for the record. But when a company, a CO2 owner is looking at the landscape and deciding what to do with the CO2 that they own, the federal government has incentivized them to permanent sequestration. For Wyoming's purposes and Wyoming's enhanced oil recovery producers, we would prefer CO2 to at least levelize the playing field for CO2 to be sent for enhanced oil recovery. I'm going to point out that Mr. Lon Whitman is here with the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute. He has great data on what that means for Wyoming. Just as a broad brush stroke about it, Wyoming has about 75 oil fields that each individually have at least 10 million barrels of recoverable oil using enhanced oil recovery with CO2 injection. CO2 injection for enhanced oil recovery is the most effective means of recovering oil in place that hasn't been recovered by initial drilling and the processes with initial drilling. Enhanced oil recovery using CO2 has in Wyoming a 100% success rate. Every project has increased the incremental barrels of oil in every case in Wyoming. So in terms of its ability to produce oil and then its subsequent revenue to Wyoming, it is a sure thing. So that, with that aside, what this does, and we'll walk through here, it's definitions, of course, on page 2. Those are pretty self-explanatory on what all that means. On page 3, starting with line 7, it establishes that that a provider could apply for, and by provider, they're talking about a carbon dioxide provider, that is a CO2 owner. You can think of anyone who produces CO2, who captures it and has it to dispose of in some way. That could be a cement plant, a coal-fired utility, a gas plant, trona mines, whoever produces CO2 and has it, that's who could apply if they have it available. So they can apply at the authority, which is the Wyoming Energy Authority, who we've established as the organization that would manage the program. I think Director Krieger is in the room who can speak to their ability to do that. So to qualify for the stimulus, there's a few things moving on to page 4. In order to receive it, you have to, of course, capture carbon. It has to be for an enhanced oil recovery, an EOR project within Wyoming, for obvious reasons. And then it also has to be CO2 that is produced in Wyoming. Make sure, yeah, that's in Romanes 3, lines 14 through 18 is produced in Wyoming. Going here, yes, this is an important one, and one that I will pause for a second on and suggest an amendment. Page 4, lines 20, going to page 5, lines 3. So part of the requirements to qualify for this stimulus is you have to qualify for and have received 45Q, the federal 45Q for enhanced oil recovery. Why did we do that? 45Q has all of the rules about monitoring how much CO2 you've captured in your project, whether it's sequestration or EOR. So they're called MRVs. Somebody smarter than me will have to remind me what that stands for, but it's essentially a plan that the operator has to give both to EPA, but also to the IRS and all of that about how the process is going to work, where they're getting the CO2, and how much is going to be stored at the end of life.
Market realization value.
That's not it. That's a great guess, Senator. That's not it. It'll come to me.
Good guess, huh?
It's going to come to me. In any case, and 45Q sets those rules. So rather than reinvent the rules, you have to meet those rules. The other part of tying it to 45Q is that, and this was very intentional, if the federal 45Q goes away, this program goes away. You can't qualify for a program that doesn't exist. And if you can't qualify for that, you can't qualify for this. So it's an off-ramp in case they get rid of 45Q. Now, the amendment I want to suggest is that our senior senator is pursuing federal legislation that would equalize 45Q at the federal level. Provide the same federal tax credit for EOR and other utilization as it does for sequestration. I would suggest an amendment that clarifies if that is successful at the federal level, then this program goes away. It shouldn't be additive if they equalize it at the federal level. Does that make sense,
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman? Okay. Yeah, so it's talking about you have to qualify and receive the tax credit there on page 5, lines 5. It allows the Energy Authority, of course, to make sure that that's possible. And then on line 17, you get to the $10 per ton. That $10 was worked on at the School of Energy Resources about what the right amount would be. And that is essentially the estimated amount. There's a $25 gap. Why are we only doing $10? There's a number of reasons for that related to transportation costs and all of that. And then also, of course, you know that a CO2 owner would sell their CO2 to an EOR producer. So there's revenue to be gained there too. So a full $25 gap bridge would be a bridge too far, quite frankly. 10 it equalizes it as best as we can tell. All of the rest of that is continue to talk about the requirements under 45Q, and then it gets to the fund paid. So here's, Mr. Chairman, I think it's important to know. This and the next bill you're going to discuss get at trying to bolster our EOR production in Wyoming, and they get at it each from a different way. In this one, what it does is it takes severance tax money earned from the incremental production of enhanced oil recovery and reinvests it in a payment to close that gap. And that payment would go to CO2 owners, not to enhanced oil producers, not my members, okay? And the idea there, of course, is to have them look at the playing field and say, doesn't matter whether it's in sequestration or EOR, we're gonna get the same. Okay, but that's the direction is to the CO2 owners. In your next bill, the direction is to EOR producers, my members, okay? In either case, the general idea is to try to reduce the price of CO2 in order to stimulate more EOR production in Wyoming. One side of the equation or the other would get a stimulus depending on which one's passed, and they work out privately what the price of CO2 is. Does that make sense, Mr. Chairman? I'm gonna pause there because the good senator is giving me a quizzical look.
No, I'm just doing this with you.
Okay,
I'm with you.
okay. All right. So the administration so on the investment side, what it does is, and I gotta be real clear about this, initially the state goes into a deficit because initially the state is funding the CO2 owners until such time as the incremental CO2 begins to overtake that in severance revenue. And then the return is over the life of fields, which is lengthy. The return on investment to Wyoming is substantial, somewhere in the 31% range return on investment. But it's not immediate. And I think that should be clear about that. It takes time before the production reaches that. I think it was an 8-year, I believe, turnaround time from investment to starting to get a return on investment.
Yes, go ahead.
I'd like a little clarification right there. I'd like a little clarification if I could on that point.
Sure.
Okay, Mr. Obermuller, just for clarification, that $10 in severance tax is being paid by the producer. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cooper, yeah, so I think you're on the right track. Basically, what it does is we know in order to start the program, we've got to start with a seed of money in order to fund the equalization part. Once that CO2 goes to a producer who's drilling using that CO2, that starts to accrue severance tax money at 6%. There's no tax break for my members under this bill. What the bill does is it takes 3% of that severance that they pay and puts it into this fund made under this bill. And it reinvests that money to circle back, to refill what Wyoming put into it, and then to fund it in perpetuity after that. So rather than like the next bill, which I also support, but with next bill, which is just a straight 3% exemption for EOR purposes, this is no tax break for my members. It reinvests in helping to stimulate EOR production.
Go ahead.
So I think I've just explained most of it there. There's reversions if no projects happen. We create this account, we seed the account, no projects happen, goes right back into the state. State coffers, I think the LSRA, if I'm not mistaken. The senator can correct me. But it does, there is an initial appropriation of 10 million in order to initially seed it. And that's what gets recovered over time. Either returned or recovered, whichever, if there's no projects. So that's essentially the bill, Mr. Chairman. With respect to the technology and the potential fields and the potential revenue and all of that related to EOR, I would, I don't want to make him come up here, but he did drive down here from Casper. I would suggest that Director Whitman come talk a little bit about that.
Okay, any questions? Senator Cooper?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Obermueller, can you give us just a real brief history on the 45Q, the age of it? It's my understanding that was a Trump 1 program and it had somehow survived the most recent administration. Is that correct?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, in fact, Director Whitman might be able to explain that better. I have it here. I can find it in a couple of minutes in terms of the whole history. I can find it. But essentially, it was in place, I think, prior to, as the senator was starting to point out, it was in place prior to President Trump's first term. It had lower amounts. Congress, even prior to us working on this bill, upped all of those amounts. And that's when they put in the bifurcation of $85 per ton for sequestration and $60 for EOR, and it's $140, I think, something for direct air capture, as it currently sits. So that's been in place for a long time. It's not an agency created program. It's a congressionally created program. So if it were to go away, they would have to repeal it. It's not going to go away by executive order or by the new administration or anything like that. They would have to repeal it.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions for Mr. Obermueller? Other questions? I have a question. On page 5, second line, it says available for carbon oxide. I think that should say carbon dioxide, if I'm not mistaken. Are you in agreement with that, Mr. Obermueller? If so, I'll have it just be a typo correction.
Can you point out the reference, Mr. Chairman, please? Just so I can.
Page 5, line 2, says available for carbon oxide sequestration. Yes.
So we had that discussion during the interim, raising the same thing, and carbon dioxide is certainly accurate to what we're doing, but 45Q awkwardly uses carbon oxide as opposed to carbon dioxide in the language of the 45Q. So our LSO, Mr. Fuller, for these passages mirrored the 45Q language just so that it was an identical compliance issue. So you're right, it would read better if it were carbon dioxide, but it wasn't a typo. It was intentional based
okay.
on the language used in 45Q.
Okay, well, if the feds make a mistake, we want to repeat it.
Help them out, exactly.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Well,
Okay. All right, we'll leave it alone then. We won't correct.
Mr. Chairman, technically carbon monoxide would be eligible. And so,
Oh, really?
don't miss out on the opportunity for
Oh.
good sequestration of a large amount of carbon monoxide if you
Yeah.
don't have quite enough oxygen to get the job done.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. All right. We're done with Mr. Obermueller, and we're gonna hear from you. All right, let's do it. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm Lon Whitman, Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I will comment on that MRV, which was a question. That's the monitoring, reporting, and verification.
That's what I thought it was, yeah. Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
market realization value.
Yeah.
He mentioned there, right?
And if there's other questions I can address, I'm happy to do that.
Other questions on EORI? We have the guy who knows all about EORI. Go ahead, Senator.
Lon, I just think it would be helpful maybe for a quick high-level overview of some of the economic analysis you did of the potential utility for this, as well as maybe just a little bit about why $10 instead of $25. Those would both be useful.
Mr. Chairman, sure. So we did spend quite a bit of time in committee. We worked with an operator, several operators actually, to try to get actual numbers to look at this question of that difference between 80, 85 and 60 at the time, coming up with that $25 difference. So there were a lot of questions how we came up at the end with the $10 per ton leveling the playing field. So for a capture project that has to transport the CO2 captured to a dedicated storage site, what is never discussed in that bill or looked at is the transportation cost and the storage fee. And through analysis with Denbury in particular, who does do that type of work, the number that was calculated was that $10 per ton to level the playing field. That $25 going down, the $15 per ton was the transport fee and a storage fee. So to look at the two equally, EOR versus a dedicated storage project, you're really looking at that $10 per ton, which we were trying to incentivize, the bill was trying to incentivize to level that playing field, to increase the interest in selling CO2 for EOR versus permanently storing it.
Do you know what the rate would be with this federal that Barrasso is proposing, an Enhanced Energy Recovery Act? Would that just be the $10 or would that be even more than that?
Mr. Chairman, we worked on that with Senator Barrasso, and the final numbers were $85 for dedicated or enhanced oil recovery, and $150 for DAC, for direct air capture.
Oh,
Which doesn't, we have no projects in Wyoming currently for DAC, so.
well, and there's one more category, isn't there?
No, you had direct air capture, EOR, or dedicated storage. So
So-
now the dedicated and EOR would be level.
Would be the same, okay. Any other questions? Any other questions for Lon? Yes, Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Whitman, a lot of this CO2 that we're dealing with right now for enhanced oil recovery is coming from a producer in western Wyoming. Is that producer paying severance tax on that CO2 right now?
Mr. Chairman, yes, they are.
Huh, that's quite a little bit then, isn't it? Huh. Okay,
Follow up, sir?
yeah.
Oh, that, Mr. Whitman, that severance tax would continue under this program, is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Yes, Senator Rothfuss.
Yeah, and that's only for produced
Cell.
CO2, not for anthropogenic, and it's at a 2% severance rate because it's on the other category that we have as opposed to, say, 6% or something else, so just for clarification.
If the federal one goes through, we've got a lot of things in our bill about only in Wyoming. The federal one won't have anything in there about only in Wyoming. So our producers could sell their CO2 out of state also then. I mean, they can do it now, but we're trying to encourage them to use it in Wyoming.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Okay, any other questions for Mr. Whitman?
I have one.
One more question, Lon.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Whitman, Mr. Obermueller referred to 75 fields identified currently. Are those all in the Powder River Basin, or have we identified fields, say, in the Bighorn Basin included in that 75?
Mr. Chairman, that's statewide, all basins. So again, I think what's important to recognize that would be what we would call a high-level screening, 30,000 foot. So they meet reservoir parameters and they have a minimum reserve amount left that would justify the project. But it doesn't look at the individual company economics. And I think part of the study for this original bill 2 years ago was looking at from the operator perspective. So for instance, what you're seeing happening in the last CO2 EOR project in Wyoming was over 12 years ago. But we have 3 current developing projects. One is slightly more advanced than the other 2. They have a letter of interest from Exxon for their supply of CO2, so I think you'll see that project advanced. They plan to be online July of 2026. But the value, particularly in that project from the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute perspective, they took 3 smaller fields that would not have been economic, clustered those together to facilitate the economics on the project and justify them. I think there was mention earlier of timelines for these payments. Of course, this is perhaps more for Senate File 18, but production starting in 2026 doesn't maximize for almost 8 years. So the revenue back you will start seeing very soon, but your maximum value is quite a number of years out. This bill 17 specifically for capture projects. Look, we don't get involved at that level with capture or dedicated storage, but we do monitor those projects. 3 current capture type projects developing. One's actually drilling wells now at Frontier Carbon Solutions is drilling their first well. Tallgrass is advancing those. Those 2 projects, when they were launched, have stated no sale of CO2 for EOR. The 3rd project has to do with 8 Rivers and Rocky Mountain Power on capture either Dave Johnston or WyoDAC. They clearly stated only for sale for EOR. So that project, again, we're not following the capture or the technology part of that, but you're probably talking 10 to 15 years before that project is online. So the sale of CO2 for EOR is that far out. And I believe this bill targeted 2034 as the shutdown date or reversion date. So these projects take a long time. The EOR project in that 3-field cluster, they've been working on that well over 2 years, 18 months negotiations with Exxon. They're lengthy. The project for just the field costs to prepare the field is well over $60 million. So looking at the overhead saying, well, we've got all these great fields, it requires, 1, the supply of CO2. There has to be a transport mechanism to get it to the field, and you have to have an operator that is willing to spend $60 million just to get the field ready. But we do have 3 current projects, all of which are advancing very, very nicely.
Well, bit of a follow-up. So based on our 12-year-old EOR project, I'm assuming that was probably Patrick Draw. Can you tell us what the success rate was there?
Mr. Chairman, yeah, your last start project for EOR was at Grieve Field. And that was actually started by Elk Petroleum, then Denbury became a partner, then Denbury took the entire project, now owned by Exxon, which they're calling Exxon Denbury or Denbury Exxon. As Mr. Obermuller mentioned, we've never had an unsuccessful EOR project in Wyoming. I don't think it's a case of reservoir issues or that type of thing that prevent those projects from moving forward. The Bighorn Basin obviously is not going to advance without a pipeline into the Bighorn Basin. The trend for activities in Wyoming for enhanced oil recovery with CO2 has all been along those trunk lines that go from Chute Creek all the way up near Gillette and on into North Dakota. And the activity grew there because the supply went through. So Grieve would have been your last start, which I think is now pushing almost 13 years ago. Denbury did significant work when they took that field over, and I don't know the current production rate, but they've more than tripled that initial rate. I mean, there's plenty of really excellent examples. That Monell field in 2000, this is 2024, 2002, well, wherever the start date was, I'm getting confused on my dates, their production from that field was 17 barrels a day. Through the injection CO2 in that process, that rate went to 7,000 and has remained high through the life of that project. Beaver Creek is another one that was at roughly 150 barrels a day that went to 4,000. So, I mean, it's extremely effective. When the company dedicated, Denbury that's all they did in their company was CO2 EOR. So we're watched to see if those fields are sold, who the new operators are. But again, we're very pleased at EORI to have 3 projects that we're directly involved with that are moving forward. There's some unbelievable reserve potential out of those.
Lon, would you have that data available that you could send it to us of the fields and how much they were and how much that CO2 made the difference for them?
Mr. Chairman, I'd be glad to get you that. Yeah,
Wonderful.
We have some nice reports available.
I think I might have written it down wrong, or I didn't understand the previous speaker. I think he said there was 75 oil fields using CO2 now.
No,
Is that 75 wells?
Mr. Chairman, that's 75 potential fields
Oh,
that met
potential.
that criteria.
Okay,
So they had to have a minimum reserve remaining and the proper reservoir characteristics.
yeah, yeah. I'm like Senator Cooper, I'm interested in that flowing into the Bighorn Basin because we're losing production pretty bad in the Bighorn Basin. But like you say, we have to have a pipeline that would take care of that. So, any other questions for Mr. Whitman? Other questions? Hearing none, thank you, men, for your presentation. Anyone, any agencies that'd like to speak on Senate File 17? Any agencies? An agency, there they are.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be brief. Rob Krieger, Executive Director of the Energy Authority. We're called out to implement some of this, which we're well-equipped and happy to do. So my only suggestion, Mr. Obermuller hit on, so I think you guys covered that well. So just want to say we're good to go.
Any questions for Rob? No questions for Rob. All right, Rob, thank you.
Chairman Anderson, my name is Matt Sachet. I am the Administrator of the Mineral Tax Division of the Department of Revenue. I am the new Craig, if you guys know. Everybody knows the old Craig. I just wanted to step up here, and Senator Cooper had some questions concerning the severance tax, and I just wanted to clarify that. If CO2 is produced from a natural gas stream, then it is considered part of that natural gas stream and is taxed for severance purposes. That being said, if that CO2 then goes to do tertiary recovery for oil, the company purchasing the CO2 and producing the oil is allowed to take the taxes paid by the CO2 producer against what they're paying on the oil. So that's how that would happen. If, for example, as Mr. Obermuller stated, the CO2 comes from something else, a power plant that uses coal and produces CO2, we do not tax that production. It's not severed from the ground, it's considered part of coal. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Senator Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Director. Matt, would you say that, that coal producer has paid taxes on that, severance taxes on that coal, on that CO2 as being part of the coal?
Chairman Anderson, Senator Cooper, I don't really know. They're usually purchasing BTU content, and CO2 has generally been considered a byproduct that they have to dispose of. So if you're purchasing coal, you're purchasing the BTUs to power your plant. So I don't know if that would be included in the price of the coal.
Yeah, Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks. Matt, I do have a question about the rate at which that's at. If you said that it's being assessed as severance on the natural gas stream, as a component of the natural gas stream, are you taxing the severance on the CO2 as a portion of the natural gas stream and therefore at the natural gas rate? Or are you using the other rate for the component of, or the portion of the stream that is CO2?
Chairman Anderson, Senator Rothfuss, we charge the 6% severance, full severance tax for natural gas.
Because it's the entire stream. Okay.
Correct.
Interesting. Thank you.
Other questions? Other questions? Thank you, Matt. Thank you for being here, and thank you for clearing up things. Anyone else? Anyone else? Any other agencies? Any legislators? Welcome to Representative Heiner to our meeting. Thank you. Thank you. Any public like to speak? Any public like to speak on this? Seeing none, we don't have any on the Zoom
No, Mr. Chairman,
on this?
for this
Okay.
bill.
All right, then we'll close public comment. And committee, what's your pleasure? Moved by Cooper, seconded by,
Give it a minute.
yeah, well, I need a second first.
Second.
Moved and seconded, moved by Cooper and seconded by Rothfuss. And somebody has an amendment they want to put on this.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Senator Rothfuss.
This is going to be a conceptual amendment because I'd like to work with Mr. Fuller to get the language exactly right, but I move to amend on page 5 to add a new Romanet, probably a new Romanet 5, that would make it clear that if the new, this new act passes and the 45Q is equal between the enhanced oil recovery and the permanent sequestration, that this act is no longer in effect. So it would just be one additional paragraph to that extent to make it clear that it goes away if they're equalized. And I think the language would be based on equalizing the 45Q. We wouldn't need to refer to the act. It would basically be if the problem goes away, this act goes away. So that's the motion, and I would work with Mr. Fuller on the specific language.
And why do you like putting it in there
Mr. Chairman,
instead of at the end?
that's where the conditions of this come into play, and it's actually, again, the Romanet 5 that we have there is a reliance on a 45Q tax credit for the stimulus to be authorized. This
Okay.
whole act effectively becomes moot if 45Q goes away, and that was an elegant way of putting in what is effectively a repealer on this if 45Q is repealed. So it seems that adding the language in the same way, that if the 45Q credits are equalized, then you're no longer eligible for a credit. You don't have to repeal the entire act. We would then go in later, in theory, if we were good little legislators, and figure out how to clean up statute. But it would basically just make it so that the program didn't go into effect from that point forward, because you would have an equalization between the 45Q tax credits and so there'd be no necessity for it.
Okay, Sue, do you have that amendment? Do you?
Mr. Chairman, what I would ask is Senator Rothfuss provide some language. I'll document in here, but without specific. Will you be working?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I would work with LSO attorney and figure out what appropriate language is there. And Brian Fuller can probably do it in about 12 seconds because he's very familiar with this draft.
But, and do I have a second on that amendment?
Second.
Seconded by Nethercott. So everybody understand that what we're talking about is if the Enhanced Energy Recovery Act federally goes through, this bill becomes mute. And how we say that is up to the LSO attorney. Any other discussion on this amendment? Other discussion on this amendment? Hearing none, sensing the body's ready to vote. All in favor of the amendment, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. That amendment squeaks by. Any other amendments to the bill? Any other amendments? I know that we have a request for an appropriation of 10 million on this, so I will let the senator from Little Snake River mention that in the meeting so that we all get the message that there's one here. But we also will send through a registration form to send it to the committee number 2.
And Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Just, one final thought on that. That appropriation, if this is successful, it's effectively not spent, but it's used as a fund that starts up the process and then backfills and then is paid back. So it's not a $10 million expenditure, but we need a $10 million pool of funding. And I think we were comfortable with 10 million, but I think if we actually did enough really quickly, we'd have to come back and ask for an additional appropriation. But it all comes pouring back in, we think, with around an 8-year lag of time. So it's important to realize we're not spending $10 million, but we are committing $10 million, which to me is different.
The interesting thing here is that we could do this because the feds may not put this Enhanced Energy Recovery Act through for quite a few years. And we may be doing our program long before they get theirs done. So we may use this 10 million to front this project.
Agreed.
Mr.
So,
Chairman,
yes,
to that effect, we can sit here and wait for the feds to do it, or we can be proactive.
I think it's good that we be proactive, but I would like to see the feds do it
Obviously,
also.
No, it's good. That'd be good if it passes.
Okay, anything else? Anything else on 17? If not, we're going to do roll call. We'll always do a roll call on that bid.
I like roll call.
You like roll call. So does Rothfuss. He always tells me to do that. Roll call then, Sue, on 17.
Mr. Chairman, this is a roll call vote for Senate File 17. Senator Cooper.
Aye.
Senator Jones.
Aye.
Senator Nethercott.
Aye.
Senator Rothfuss.
Aye.
Chairman Anderson.
Aye. That Senate File 17 has squeaked by the Senate Minerals Committee. Next up is Senate File 18, which has some similarities to 17. And Senator Rothfuss, are you the guy that's going to tell us about this one too?
Well, Pete,
Or
Mr. Obermueller, likes it, so you might want to hear from him. I can tell you what it does, but I don't like this bill as well.
okay, let's hear.
It's certainly aimed at the same problem.
Let's hear it from Senator, or from,
Yeah, try and get a positive.
let's hear it from somebody positive.
Get a
Obermueller.
positive overview of it before.
I appreciate the committee and the senator. So Senate File 18 is an attempt to kind of get at the same thing. It's just in a way that maybe is a little more familiar with a lot of legislators, which is simply a severance tax reduction for enhanced oil recovery. So the previous one took 3% and my company's will pay 6% severance, and 3% of that will be reinvested back into the program in the bill you just passed. In this case, there is no program like that. It's just a 3% severance tax reduction for enhanced oil recovery projects within Wyoming using CO2 sourced from Wyoming. It's pretty much that simple. It is attempting to get at the same thorny problem, as you heard Director Whitman talk about, that our last EOR project was 12 or 13 years ago. And yet we have all of these resources just that are ripe for EOR, and we don't have these projects. Why? A lot of reasons. Can't pin it on any particular one, but one, of course, is the price of CO2, which is really what the previous bill is trying to get at. It's trying to counteract federal influence on the price of CO2. That's what that one is doing. This one actually is more about counteracting the infrastructure expense of doing EOR projects. So we talked about the Bighorn Basin, Senator Cooper, but also that one is, we need a room full of very smart people to think about how to do infrastructure in the Bighorn Basin, and I'd be willing to do that anytime with you, Senator. But even if you do much smaller projects, like the one Director Whitman was talking about, that's really like about 40 miles from the offtake of the main CO2 pipeline that runs from the southwest to the northeast in Wyoming. The cost of building that pipeline by itself is extraordinary, prohibitively so. So the idea here is more to attack the infrastructure side by allowing for a little bit of a severance tax cut in order to provide more capital. Now, it will have an influence on the price of carbon too, CO2 as well, because the CO2 owner will know that my producers are getting a severance tax break, and that I imagine, I won't be in the room, but I imagine they'll discuss that in their negotiations on the price of CO2. But the idea here is to help reduce costs so that the capital can be expended to make these projects happen. Some of the senators last year expressed concern to me. It was defeated on introduction vote, so it never was debated on the merits, I should point out. But prior to it, some of the senators were worried that, these are small companies and they don't, they're not, this isn't small companies doing this. These are companies that are able to make these projects happen. But that being said, technologically able to make it happen. But that being said, the input costs are pretty extraordinary. So one side CO2 owners, other side production. Theoretically, both bills could pass. I do not anticipate that happening. I would like for this committee and the Senate, quite frankly, to move both of these bills to the other side. How do I say? The previous bill may run into unrelated headwinds on the other side.
Yes, I think you're right.
Wow.
That's really good.
Yeah, unrelated was a good word for that. Yeah. It's a nice politically correct word for that.
We want you to start with.
This bill talks about carbon capture and utilization for oil and gas recovery. I didn't realize we used CO2 for gas recovery. Is that something new, or are we doing that now?
Mr. Chairman, I don't believe we're not using CO2 for gas recovery. It's an oil recovery. Yeah, you get associated gas. but-
That's why it's saying it, it's oil and gas. recovery.
Yeah.
It is a term, oil and gas.
Okay. Okay.
You have an ex-
We have an expert on that. He can tell us all the gas we've recovered.
Brief question, Mr. Chairman. Have a chair.
Mr. Chairman, there is actually, there are projects, developing projects in Wyoming for enhanced gas recovery using CO2.
Oh, I'll be doing
And that is related probably largely to the 45Q. Again, if you're storing through enhanced gas recovery, that is applicable under 45Q. So there is, I believe, one project in permitting phase. And we may see more interest in that.
So we really don't know any results for a gas recovery EORI project.
Mr. Chairman, no, we don't have any.
And the
Any results?
projections that the company is using, is it pretty large?
It's economically viable, Mr. Chairman.
Huh. Well, good. Good. All right, any other questions for the two presenters?
I have one.
Oh, one from Mr. Cooper, Senator Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, would you say we're looking at a situation here where are we trying to recover 3% of 4 or 5, maybe 6,000 barrels a day as compared to 6% of 0 barrels a day? Is that a fair comparison?
Mr. Chairman, I think that is a fair statement.
Mr. Chairman, yes, I think we should all look from the perspective that the reserves and the production you're talking about will not be produced, likely not produced without CO2 EOR. So the revenue received is revenue that you would not have seen without the project developing.
In light of that, the producer, this is going to give somebody a break. And the producer is getting a lot more production, even with the 6%. He gets a lot more production, a lot more revenue. Does he really need a break on this to go ahead? Are we encouraging anything here, or are we just giving a break?
Mr. Chairman, I think that's the objective of the bill, is to incentivize new projects starting. So the project we were discussing earlier with the 3-field cluster in the Metallusa Formation, estimated startup operating costs just for the field is $60 million. The pipeline's another $40. And you have your CO2 purchase cost, which is a lot. So I think it's also important to remember that the supplier of the captured CO2 receives the 45Q tax benefit, not the oil and gas operator. So the difference to me in this bill versus 17 is that now the operator receives a benefit, which hopefully would incentivize increased CO2 EOR activity in the state.
Mr. Chairman, if I might add, I think most of you heard me say it before, the most recent reliable comparative data on the effective tax rates for oil and gas in Wyoming indicate that Wyoming has the highest effective tax rate on oil and gas of the 10 oil and gas producing states. More than double Colorado, about triple New Mexico. That's not including federal lands. So add federal land expense to that in Wyoming, it is just not a friendly state for oil and gas from a tax perspective. This, in order to deal with the added expense that I talked about before, that's what this is trying to get at.
Questions? Questions for the presenters? All right, there are none. You covered it very well. Thank you very much, you Pete and Lon team. All right, any agencies like to talk about this? Any agencies like to talk about this one? Agencies are very quiet today. Any legislators like to talk about this one? Legislators are very quiet. Any public like to talk about this one? Public is very quiet. There's nobody on Zoom, is there?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, all right, we'll close public comment, and committee, what's your pleasure? Moved by Cooper, seconded by Nethercott. Yes, Senator.
So, Mr. Chairman, I don't like this bill nearly as well, but I do understand the concern that Mr. Obermueller has about trying to get something across the finish line. This one's very different. It's an across-the-board severance tax credit effectively, so it affects all existing projects. So you basically just cut the severance tax in half for every existing EOR project in the state. It's a blunt instrument where the other is a scalpel trying to specifically resolve a problem. The fact that it is Wyoming CO2 certainly helps to incentivize and stimulate some development in Wyoming and making it sure that it's good for Wyoming, but not in the same way as the other. And, you know, other concerns I have is, honestly, you've got some structural concerns. Enhanced oil and gas recovery, which is defined in here as it ends up being defined reasonably well, but then it requires CO2 to be used. There are a number of other enhanced oil recovery techniques that don't use CO2, although what we've been talking about today were the CO2 enhanced oil recovery techniques. This is specific only to those, but it's a little bit confusing from that standpoint, I think, to talk about it being an incentive for enhanced oil and gas recovery and then only apply to one technique that's available. And then the final thing is the way this is structured. I'm left kind of wondering about moving forward. You have some projects that will do initial stimulation with CO2 drive instead of water drive. I worked on projects years ago that did that, looking at why do a water flood when you can initially do a CO2 flood and get your residual oil saturation down to 2% in the first drive and get in and out quick. As I read it, this legislation would then provide significant motivation to do that because you would get 50% severance tax reduction on the entirety of the project at that point. So your entire new production, not just your secondary oil production, would be advantaged that way, but you wouldn't have necessarily an additional cost associated with it being a legacy project. So it just doesn't, it's not as well developed and thought through. I definitely understand why industry is good with it. I would be too. A 50% tax cut is always good if you're industry. I would absolutely be here supporting it if I were industry. But again, it's the state taxpayer money. I'm not convinced this bill leads to new projects, and changes outcomes in the same way that the other legislation clearly does, where it debiases the marketplace on 45Q projects. And one of the other things we were looking at with the other legislation was it provides motivation really to have 45Q projects, which are large capital intensive projects in the state of Wyoming. That's a good thing for Wyoming all by itself. Even if nobody was consuming that CO2, you've got such a labor intensive and property tax intensive and sales and use tax intensive project that locating those 45Q type projects in Wyoming is good for the diversification of the Wyoming economy all by itself. And then using the product of those in the state of Wyoming for oil and gas development is great for the state of Wyoming. So you have two sides winning on that. You've got a lot of incentive for development in the state of Wyoming. It doesn't seem like this other system really incentivizes anyone to locate in the state of Wyoming because remember, they're getting the full 45Q tax credit regardless of which state they work in, and it doesn't advantage them financially to be in the state of Wyoming to build that 45Q project. So those are the reasons why I think the first bill is substantially better than the second bill. All that said, I don't necessarily think it's a bad idea to advance both bills over to the House based on the concerns that are raised, candidly. I think we may struggle. And I don't know that the good bill ends up making it through. So I think I'm going to end up voting against it because I don't like the bill. I have a lot of problems with it, but I don't necessarily think it's a bad idea to have the opportunity to advance both of them over to the House to see if one of them can get through so that at least we have something to provide some motivation for EOR in the state of Wyoming. So that's why I'll be a no vote, but I appreciate the concerns, consideration, and work that's gone into it.
Well, thank you for the short explanation.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Senator Cooper, go ahead.
I'll try to I'll try to outspeak Senator Rothfuss here, but the comparison of water injection to CO2 injection is, I don't believe valid. Most of these old fields have been water injected for years, and it's the secondary recovery, the water injection has ran its course. And a lot of them, 80 to 85% of the oil is still in place. The fields that we've been so successful in, were all water injected for years. And then after we went to CO2 injection, we were immensely successful with the CO2. So one compared to the other is not a valid comparison. They're two different, even though they sound the same, they're not exactly the same process within the rock. Secondly, as far as the incentive to produce in Wyoming, that Denbury pipeline goes right on out of the state into Montana and into North Dakota, where their tax rates are much more favorable. So in order to incentivize Wyoming production, if we can lower that tax rate, as Mr. Obermuller suggested, we're the highest of the 10 oil producing states. We need to do whatever we can to incentivize that production in Wyoming and keep our operators operating in Wyoming. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cooper. Anyone else? Anyone else? Any amendments or any changes? No? All right, well,
Roll call.
we'll go with it, just like it is then. Let's roll call it. And Sue, please, on Senate File 18, please.
Senator Cooper,
Aye.
Senator Jones,
Aye.
Senator Nethercott,
Aye.
Senator Rothfuss,
No.
Chairman Anderson.
Aye.
4 ayes, 1 no, Mr. Chairman.
Senate File 18 will go to the floor. It has a appropriation. We'll let the senator from Baggs remind us of that. And we will put that to committee number 2. I don't think we have time for Senate File 19 to give it justice it deserves. So I think we'll move that to Monday. There's one person online. I'm sure they can call back in on Monday. Would you check with them, Mr. Richards or Mr. Island or whatever his name is? He can? Okay, all right. He can call back in on Monday then. And so we'll hear 19 on Monday. With that, the Senate Minerals Committee is adjourned. Thank you.
Jim, can I leave a thing for